Lisa Carter stood in line with 40 other young humans waiting to enter the big metal doors of the Terran Naval Academy. She was 18 years old and barely came up to the shoulders of most other cadets around her. Her red hair was cut short, and her green eyes looked straight ahead with the kind of focus that made older people nervous. The morning sun reflected off the academy's tall silver towers, and Lisa felt her heart beat faster as she thought about the next 4 years of her life. The doors opened with a loud hiss, and the cadets walked into a massive hall filled with floating screens and holographic displays. Lisa had never seen anything like it before. She came from a small farming colony where the most advanced technology was the weather control system that kept their crops from dying. Now she was surrounded by machines that could think and talk and show her images from across the galaxy. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched the new cadets file in and shook his head slightly. Every year they seemed to get younger and smaller. He was a tall man with gray hair and scars on his hands from 20 years of military service. His job was to turn these kids into soldiers and officers who could protect humanity from the dangers that lived in the dark spaces between stars. Some of them would make it and some would not. That was just how things worked. High above the main floor in a special viewing area sat Ambassador Zekthal from the Vorthic Empire. His species looked like giant lizards that walked on 2 legs, and had been ruling parts of the galaxy for thousands of years. The Vorthak thought humans were weak and stupid because they were new to space travel and their bodies were soft compared to most alien races. Zekthal was here to watch human military training and report back to his leaders about whether humans posed any real threat to their empire. The ambassador looked down at the small, human female with red hair and almost laughed. She was so tiny and fragile-looking. On his world, warriors did not begin training until they were 30 years old and had grown to their full size and strength. These humans threw their children into military service when they were barely adults. It seemed foolish and wasteful to him. Lisa felt eyes watching her and looked up to see the alien in the viewing gallery. She had seen pictures of Vorthak before, but never a real one. He was huge and covered in green scales that caught the light. His yellow eyes stared down at her with what looked like amusement or maybe contempt. Lisa stared right back and did not look away until Commander Morrison started talking. The commander's voice filled the hall as he began the welcoming speech that he gave every year. He talked about duty and honor and the long tradition of human military service. He explained that they would learn to fight in space and on alien worlds, and that many of them would see combat before they graduated. Some would die in training and others would die in their first real battle. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and humanity needed warriors who could face that danger without backing down. Lisa listened to every word, but kept thinking about the alien watching from above. She had grown up hearing stories about how other species looked down on humans. They called Earth's people the baby race because humans had only been traveling between stars for 50 years, while some aliens had been doing it for millions of years. Many alien governments did not take human diplomats seriously, and some actively worked against human colonies and trade routes. During the first week of training, Lisa struggled with almost everything. The weapons were heavier than she expected, and the targeting systems were more complex than anything she had used before. Zero-gravity training made her sick, and she threw up 3 times during her first spacewalk simulation. The alien biology classes were full of information about creatures that could kill humans in dozens of horrible ways. Her test scores were barely passing, and she could see disappointment in Commander Morrison's eyes, but Lisa never gave up and never asked for easier assignments. When other cadets complained about the training being too hard, she just worked longer hours. When the combat instructors told her she was too small to be effective in close quarters fighting, she practiced until her hands bled. When the flight simulator crashed her ship for the 10th time in a row, she climbed back in and tried again. The other cadets started to notice that Lisa Carter never quit anything. She might fail at something over and over, but she always came back the next day, ready to try again. Some thought she was crazy, and others thought she was trying too hard to prove something. None of them understood that Lisa simply could not accept the idea of giving up. Ambassador Zekthal watched the small human female through the first month of training and filed regular reports with his superiors. He noted her poor performance in most areas and her obvious physical limitations, but something about her behavior bothered him in ways he could not explain. The way she kept trying even after repeated failures seemed almost unnatural to him. Most creatures learn to avoid pain and failure, but this one seemed to seek it out. 3 months after starting at the academy, Lisa Carter found herself walking through the corridors of the UES Defender. The ship was bigger than her entire home colony and filled with machinery that hummed and beeped in ways that still amazed her. She carried her small bag of belongings and tried not to look too excited about her first real assignment in space. Most cadets did not get to serve on active duty ships until their second year, but Lisa had requested extra training and commander Morrison had decided to see what she could handle. Captain Helen Rodriguez was waiting for Lisa in the ship's main briefing room. The captain was a woman in her 40s with short black hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. She had fought in the Proxima conflicts, where humans first learned that some alien species would kill them just for existing. Rodriguez looked at the young cadet and wondered if she was making a mistake by bringing someone so inexperienced on a real mission. The Defender's mission was simple enough, or at least it seemed that way. Several cargo ships had gone missing in the Kepler 442 system over the past 2 months. The ships carried basic supplies to mining colonies and research stations, so their loss was not critical, but the pattern worried Fleet Command. Ships did not just disappear without leaving some kind of trace behind. Pirates usually left wreckage, and alien raiders always demanded ransom payments. This was different, and different meant dangerous. Lisa spent her first week aboard the Defender learning how everything worked. She followed senior crew members around and asked questions that sometimes annoyed them but also showed that she was paying attention. The ship's weapons officer taught her how to operate the defensive systems, and the navigation chief showed her how to plot courses through hyperspace. Every day she learned something new, and every night she fell asleep exhausted but happy. The crew of the Defender was made up of veterans who had been serving together for years. They had fought space pirates and alien raiders and survived battles that killed thousands of other humans. To them, Lisa was just a kid who would probably wash out of the service within a year. They were not mean to her, but they did not take her seriously either. She was too young and too small and had never seen real combat. When they reached the Kepler 442 system, everything looked normal at first. The star burned bright and steady, and the planets moved in their usual orbits. The asteroid belt where most of the mining happened showed up on sensors exactly as it should. There were no signs of battle damage or alien ships or anything else that might explain what happened to the missing cargo vessels. Captain Rodriguez ordered a detailed scan of the entire system while the Defender moved slowly through the shipping lanes where the lost ships had last been seen. The crew worked in shifts around the clock looking for anything unusual. After 2 days, they found debris from one of the missing ships floating near a large asteroid. The metal had been torn apart in ways that did not match any known weapon signatures. That was when the first Shadow Maw appeared. Lisa was on bridge duty when the creature materialized inside the ship's hull. One moment, she was looking at normal readings on her console, and the next moment alarms were screaming and emergency lights were flashing red. The thing that came through the wall was bigger than a shuttle and darker than space itself. It had tentacles that moved like liquid smoke and eyes that burned with cold fire. Just looking at it made Lisa feel like something was crawling around inside her brain. The 40 crew members on duty froze in terror. These were people who had fought in real wars and seen their friends die in horrible ways, but none of them could move when the Shadow Maw turned its attention on them. The creature fed on fear, and the more frightened its victims became, the stronger it grew. Within seconds it had grown larger and more solid as it consumed the panic of the veteran spacers. Lisa Carter was terrified beyond anything she had ever experienced. Her hands shook and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Every instinct told her to run or hide or curl up in a corner until the nightmare went away. But she also saw that nobody else was doing anything, and the creature was getting bigger and more dangerous with each passing second. Someone had to act, even if that someone was just a cadet who barely knew how to operate a coffee machine. She grabbed an emergency plasma rifle from the wall mount next to her station and started firing. The weapon was heavy and kicked hard against her shoulder with each shot. The plasma bolts hit the shadow maw and made it shriek in surprise. The creature had expected fear and paralysis, but instead it was getting burned by someone who should have been cowering in terror. The shadow maw hesitated for just a moment, confused by this small human who was fighting back when everyone else had given up. That moment of uncertainty was all Captain Rodriguez needed to break free from her own fear and start shouting orders. The veteran crew snapped out of their paralysis and began working together to drive the creature back through the hull breach it had created. The battle lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. When it was over, the Shadow Maw had retreated back into whatever dimension it came from, and the ship's emergency systems had sealed the hull breach. 3 crew members were dead and 6 more were injured, but the ship was intact and the mission could continue. Captain Rodriguez found Lisa sitting on the floor next to her station, still holding the plasma rifle. The young cadet was shaking and pale, but her eyes were still alert and focused. When the captain asked if she was hurt, Lisa just shook her head and said she was fine. She did not seem to understand that what she had done was anything special. Word about what happened on the UES Defender spread through human space faster than anyone expected. Military communications networks carried official reports about the Shadow Maw encounter, and within days every naval base and academy knew that a cadet had been the first to fight back against one of the galaxy's most feared predators. The story grew as it traveled, and some versions made Lisa Carter sound like she had single-handedly destroyed the creature, but the basic facts remained the same. When experienced veterans froze in terror, a first-year cadet had grabbed a weapon and started shooting. Human fleet commanders were pleased, but not really surprised by the news. They had seen similar things happen before during the early days of human expansion into space. Young crew members often performed better in crisis situations than older ones because they had not yet learned to be properly afraid of things that could kill them. The military brass filed the incident report and made a note to keep track of Cadet Carter's future progress, but news of the encounter reached more than just human audiences. Alien intelligence networks also picked up the story and began analyzing what it might mean. The Vorthic Empire's Military Intelligence Division received detailed reports from Ambassador Zechthel, who had been watching human training programs. The reports described how humans seemed to produce unpredictable individuals who did not follow normal behavioral patterns when faced with deadly threats. Deep in space where no government-claimed territory, the Ravagers received information about the Shadow Maw incident through their network of spies and informants. The Ravagers were cybernetic pirates who had been raiding shipping lanes for hundreds of years. They had never lost a battle and never retreated from any fight. Their bodies were part machine and part alien flesh, designed for war and conquest. When they heard about a human cadet fighting a Shadow Maw, they accessed their tactical databases to learn more about human military capabilities. The Void Hunters also learned about what happened in the Kepler 442 system. These creatures existed partly in normal space and partly in dimensions that most species could not even perceive. They fed on life energy and had been terrorizing civilizations for millions of years. Their ancient minds processed the information about the small human female and compared it to thousands of years of experience with different prey species. Something about the incident did not match their understanding of how young beings should behave when confronted with superior predators. Back on his homeworld, Ambassador Zechthel stood before the Vorthic High Council and delivered his monthly report on human military activities. The council chamber was a vast hall carved from black stone with seats arranged in tiers that rose toward a domed ceiling. Dozens of Vorthic nobles and military leaders listened as the ambassador described what he had observed at the Human Naval Academy and during various training exercises. When Zechthel mentioned the Shadow Maw incident, the council members became more interested. Shadow Maws were creatures that even the mighty Vorthic Empire avoided when possible. They had destroyed entire Vorthak battle fleets in the past and were considered one of the few threats that could challenge Vorthak military supremacy. The idea that a human child had stood against such a creature seemed impossible. The Council's military advisor, General Thakmar, asked for more details about human cadet training programs. He wanted to understand how humans prepared their young for military service and what made them behave so differently from other species. Zekthal explained that humans began combat training at very young ages and seemed to deliberately expose their cadets to dangerous situations that would kill or traumatize the young of most other species. Meanwhile, Lisa Carter continued her training aboard the Defender as if nothing unusual had happened. She still struggled with advanced weapon systems and zero-gravity maneuvers. Her test scores remained barely adequate, and she needed extra help with alien psychology courses. But the crew's attitude toward her had changed completely. They no longer saw her as just another cadet who would probably wash out. Now they watched her with respect and curiosity, wondering what she might do next. Captain Rodriguez assigned Lisa to additional combat training sessions and made sure she learned how to operate every weapon system on the ship. The captain had fought shadow maws before and knew that encountering one was usually a death sentence for everyone involved. The fact that Lisa had broken the creature's fear paralysis and given the crew a chance to fight back was something that professional soldiers would remember for the rest of their careers. In the dark corners of space, predator species began sharing information about human behavioral patterns. The shadow maws themselves started communicating through methods that other species could barely understand. They were ancient beings that existed across multiple dimensions, and their language was made of concepts rather than words. What they shared with each other was simple but disturbing. The young human had hurt them not just with her weapon, but with something else. Her defiance had burned them in ways they had never experienced before, the insectoid swarm that controlled several star systems also received reports about the incident. Their collective intelligence processed millions of data points every second and could predict the behavior of most species with mathematical precision. But humans continued to produce individuals who acted outside all known patterns. The swarm. Queen Zakthi issued new standing orders to her warrior castes. Any encounters with human vessels carrying cadet-level personnel were to be avoided. Unless absolutely necessary, Lisa finished her month aboard the Defender and returned to the academy for continued training. She had no idea that her name was already being discussed in war councils and intelligence briefings across the galaxy. To her, the Shadow Maw encounter had been terrifying, but not really different from any other dangerous training exercise. She had done what needed to be done because someone had to do it. The fact that veteran soldiers had been unable to act only meant that the responsibility had fallen to her. Far beyond the edge of known space, in a nebula that appeared empty on most sensor scans, a gathering unlike any other was taking place. Representatives of the galaxy's most feared predator species had come together for an emergency council that had not been called in over 1,000 years. The meeting place was a massive ancient station built by a race that had died out long before humans learned to make fire. Its halls were designed for beings that came in many different shapes and sizes, including some that existed only as energy, patterns, or collective consciousnesses. Clan Chief Vexnide of the Ravagers connected his cybernetic systems to the station's communication network and waited for the others to arrive. His body was a mixture of organic tissue and advanced machinery that had been upgraded and modified through hundreds of battles. Mechanical arms extended from his back, and his eyes had been replaced with sensors that could see across multiple spectrums of light. The Ravagers had never known defeat in battle and took pride in their ability to destroy any enemy through superior technology and ruthless tactics. The first to join the council was the entity known as the Devourer, one of the oldest and most powerful void hunters. It appeared as a shifting shadow that seemed to absorb light from around it. The Devourer had existed for millions of years and had fed on the life energy of countless civilizations. Its voice when it spoke was like the whisper of dying stars, and its presence made the station's artificial gravity fluctuate in strange ways. Next came Swarm Queen Zakthi, whose consciousness controlled billions of warrior insects spread across dozens of star systems. She appeared as a single representative body, but her real self was the collective intelligence that linked all members of her species together. The insectoids had conquered entire sectors of space through coordinated attacks that overwhelmed their enemies with sheer numbers and perfect tactical coordination. The Shadowmaw Alphas did not physically attend the council, but projected their awareness across the dimensions to participate. These ancient beings existed partly in normal space and partly in realms where the laws of physics worked differently. They communicated through concepts and emotions rather than words, and their presence filled the council chamber with an oppressive darkness that made even the other predators uncomfortable. Clan Chief Vex9 initiated the emergency protocols and began sharing data about the incident that had brought them all together. The tactical recordings from the UES Defender showed the moment when Cadet Lisa Carter had broken free from the Shadowmaw's fear paralysis and opened fire on the creature. To most observers, it would have seemed like a simple case of a young soldier doing her duty. But to these predator species, it represented something far more disturbing. The Devourer shared its analysis of human psychological patterns based on millions of years of experience with different prey species. Most young beings, when confronted with superior predators, displayed predictable behaviors that either froze in terror or tried to flee or looked to older members of their species for protection. What humans did was completely different and completely wrong according to everything the ancient predators understood about natural behavior. Swarm Queen Zakthi presented statistical models that her collective intelligence had developed to predict human actions during combat situations. The models showed that human cadets and junior officers were actually more dangerous than experienced human military personnel because their responses could not be calculated in advance. Veteran soldiers followed training protocols and established tactics, but young humans often did things that made no tactical sense but somehow worked anyway. The Shadowmaw Alphas shared their own disturbing experiences with human encounters. Over the past several years, they had tried to hunt human vessels 17 different times. In 14 of those encounters, the mission had failed not because of superior human technology or numbers, but because individual humans had done unexpected things that disrupted carefully planned attacks. In most cases, the disruptive humans had been cadets or junior crew members with minimal combat experience. Clan Chief Vex9 accessed his memory banks and displayed footage from a recent raid on a human research station. The Ravagers had expected easy victory against a facility protected by only 12 security guards. Instead, they had encountered fierce resistance led by a human cadet, who was supposed to be conducting routine training exercises. The cadet had somehow turned the station's mining equipment into improvised weapons and coordinated a defense that forced the Ravagers to retreat with heavy casualties. The council reviewed dozens of similar incidents where human cadets had turned certain defeat into victory through actions that violated every known principle of military strategy. They fought when they should have surrendered. They attacked when they should have defended. They took risks that should have gotten them killed, but somehow succeeded instead. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, the Devourer expressed what all the predators were beginning to understand. Human young ones were not weak links in their species' defenses. They were wild cards that made any engagement with humans unpredictable and therefore dangerous. The fear and uncertainty they created was actually poisonous to creatures like the Void Hunters who fed on terror and despair. Instead of nourishing negative emotions, human cadets produced a kind of burning defiance that hurt more than it helped. Swarm Queen Zakthi presented the mathematical conclusion that her collective intelligence had reached. Human cadets should be classified as class A threats more dangerous than trained human soldiers, because their behavior could not be predicted or countered through conventional tactical analysis. The recommendation was that all predator species should avoid engaging human vessels that carried cadet-level personnel unless absolutely necessary for survival. The Shadowmaw Alphas communicated their agreement through waves of dark emotion that filled the council chamber. They had learned to fear these small human females and males not because of their strength or skill, but because of their refusal to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The fear they inspired was different from normal fear. It was the kind of terror that predators felt when they realized they might have found something more dangerous than themselves. As the council ended, each species began implementing new protocols for dealing with human encounters. The galaxy's most feared predators had reached a unanimous decision. They would avoid human cadets whenever possible. 6 months after the emergency council meeting, the Kepler 442 system erupted into chaos when the largest Ravager fleet ever assembled dropped out of hyperspace near the mining colony of New Cheyenne. War Chief Nex 7 commanded 50 battle cruisers and 200 fighter craft in what was supposed to be a demonstration of Ravager superiority over human military forces. The target had been chosen specifically because it was defended by only one human warship and had a large civilian population that could not be evacuated quickly. The U.S. Valiant hung in space between the Ravager fleet and New Cheyenne like a tiny metal insect facing a swarm of mechanical predators. Captain Ben Parker stood on his ship's bridge looking at sensor readings that showed impossible odds. His crew of 200 included 15 cadets who were completing their final training assignments before graduation. Among them was Lisa Carter, who had been transferred to the Valiant after her performance aboard the Defender. Parker was a veteran of 30 years who had fought in every major human conflict since first contact with alien civilizations. He knew when a battle could be won and when it could only be survived. This engagement fell into neither category. The Ravagers had brought enough firepower to destroy his ship 50 times over, and they were moving into attack formation with the confidence of predators who knew their prey could not escape. Standard military protocol in such situations called for immediate retreat to preserve naval assets and personnel. But the 50,000 civilians on New Cheyenne needed 6 hours to complete evacuation procedures, and the Ravager fleet would reach weapons range in less than 2 hours. Parker made the decision that would define the rest of his career and the rest of his life. The Valiant would hold the line no matter what the cost. War Chief Nex 7 watched from his command ship as the single human vessel moved to intercept his fleet. The cybernetic warlord had studied human military tactics and expected the ship to either flee immediately or attempt some kind of desperate surprise attack. Instead, the humans seemed to be positioning themselves for a conventional battle, which made no sense given the overwhelming numerical disadvantage they faced. The first hour of combat went exactly as Nex 7 had predicted. His ships systematically destroyed the Valiant's weapon systems and defensive shields while taking minimal damage in return. Human resistance was fierce but futile against superior Ravager technology and firepower. Within 60 minutes, half the human crew was dead or wounded and their ship was drifting powerless through space. That was when the Valiant's artificial intelligence core suffered critical damage from a direct hit to the main computer section. Without the AI to coordinate defensive systems, the ship became even more vulnerable to enemy fire. Someone would need to manually operate the point defense weapons from an exposed maintenance pod that had no shielding and no protection from enemy targeting systems. It was a suicide mission with zero probability of survival. Once the Ravagers noticed the activity, Lisa Carter volunteered without hesitation when Captain Parker explained what needed to be done. The maintenance pod was located on the outer hull, where a single person could control all the ship's remaining defensive weapons through manual targeting and firing controls. The person operating those weapons would be completely exposed to enemy fire and would certainly die within minutes of beginning the mission. Parker looked at the 19-year-old cadet and tried to find some way to refuse her request. She was too young and too inexperienced and had not even finished her basic training. But every other qualified crew member was either dead or wounded or needed to keep the ship's basic systems functioning. Lisa was the only person available who knew how to operate the defensive grid, and she was already putting on a spacesuit. The maintenance pod was a small metal box attached to the Valiant's hull by mechanical arms that could move and rotate to track targets. Inside the cramped space, Lisa connected herself to the weapons control system and began manually operating guns that had been designed to be controlled by artificial intelligence. The work required split-second timing and perfect coordination between multiple targeting systems while under direct enemy fire for the next 4 hours. Lisa Carter single-handedly operated the ship's entire defensive network. Ravager fighters swarmed her position, like angry insects trying to destroy the tiny pod that was somehow keeping their attacks from succeeding. Plasma beams melted the hull around her and explosive missiles detonated close enough to shake her teeth loose. The vacuum of space tried to kill her through a dozen different equipment failures and system malfunctions, but she kept fighting and kept the defensive grid operational even as everything around her fell apart. The Ravagers had expected to overwhelm the human ship within minutes, but instead found themselves engaged in a grinding battle of attrition against an enemy who refused to die. Their carefully planned attack formation broke down as ship commanders became obsessed with destroying the single human who was causing them so much trouble. War Chief Neck 7 watched his tactical displays in growing frustration and anger. His sensors identified the source of human resistance as a single organic being operating from an unshielded position on the enemy ship's hull. According to his intelligence files, the being was a cadet, which meant it was young and inexperienced and should have been the weakest member of the human crew. Instead, it was fighting his entire fleet to a standstill. The Ravager commander redirected more and more of his ships to attack the maintenance pod, but somehow the tiny target kept evading destruction. The human operating the defensive systems seemed to know exactly when and where each attack was coming and managed to keep fighting even as her equipment was systematically destroyed around her. It was impossible and infuriating and completely outside all tactical parameters. When human reinforcements finally arrived in the system, they found New Cheyenne intact and the Ravager fleet in full retreat. War Chief Neck 7 had lost 23 ships and over 1,000 warriors to a single human vessel that should have been destroyed in the first few minutes of combat. His tactical reputation was ruined, and his standing among the Ravager clans would never recover from the humiliation. Lisa Carter was pulled unconscious from the wreckage of her maintenance pod by rescue teams who could barely believe she was still alive. The pod had been hit by weapons fire over 200 times, and most of its systems had failed hours before the battle ended. She had continued fighting with backup controls and emergency power while breathing recycled air from a damaged life support system. Lisa Carter woke up in the medical bay of a hospital ship 3 days after the battle at New Cheyenne. Her body was covered in bandages and connected to machines that monitored her vital signs and helped her damaged lungs process oxygen. The first thing she saw was a medal sitting on the table next to her bed. The Terran Cross for Valor was the highest decoration that human military forces could award, and it had only been given out 12 times in the past 50 years. Captain Parker was waiting in a chair beside her bed with papers that promoted her to the rank of lieutenant and assigned her to advanced officer training. The promotion meant she would skip the final 2 years of cadet service and move directly into positions of real responsibility within the human fleet. Parker tried to explain to her what she had accomplished during the battle, but Lisa seemed confused by all the attention. The news networks across human space were calling her the hero of New Cheyenne, and military analysts were studying recordings of the battle to understand how one person had held off an entire Ravager fleet. Political leaders were using her story to demonstrate human determination and resolve to alien governments, who still questioned whether humanity deserved respect in galactic affairs. Her name was being mentioned in the same breath as legendary military figures from human history, but the most important reactions were happening in places that humans knew nothing about. In the dark spaces between stars where predator species gathered to plan raids and share information, the name Lisa Carter was being whispered with something approaching fear. The story of her 4-hour battle against impossible odds had spread through networks of spies and informants until every major predator species knew about the small human female who simply would not give up. The Shadow Maws were the first to change their behavior patterns. These ancient creatures that had terrorized space lanes for millions of years began avoiding entire star systems when their scouts detected human training vessels or ships carrying cadet-level personnel. They communicated to each other through dimensions that most species could not perceive, and what they shared was a simple warning. The young humans burned too bright and hurt too much to be worth hunting. The void hunters also altered their feeding patterns to avoid encounters with human military vessels. These energy beings had consumed the life force of countless civilizations. But they found that human cadets produced a kind of spiritual fire that was painful rather than nourishing. The terror and despair that the void hunters needed to survive was transformed into something else when it came from young humans who refused to accept defeat. Ambassador Zechthel received new orders from the Vorthak High Council instructing him to continue studying human military training, but to avoid any direct contact with cadet-level personnel. The Council's military advisors had concluded that human young ones represented an unacceptable tactical risk because their behavior could not be predicted or countered through conventional strategic planning. The ambassador was told to observe from a safe distance and report on human activities without getting close enough to trigger an unpredictable response. In research facilities across Vorthak space, military scientists worked to understand what made human cadets so dangerous. Their analysis showed that other species protected their young and kept them away from dangerous situations until they reached full maturity. Humans did the opposite and seemed to deliberately expose their children to life-threatening challenges that would traumatize or kill the offspring of most other races. The difference was not just in training methods, but in something deeper that the Vorthak scientists called the human behavioral anomaly. When everything went wrong and death seemed certain and veteran warriors froze in terror, human cadets somehow found the strength to keep fighting. They did not do this because they were fearless, but because they possessed a kind of stubborn determination that refused to accept the possibility of failure. Lisa spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from her injuries and trying to understand why everyone was making such a big deal about what she had done. Military reporters asked her questions about heroism and courage and sacrifice, but she did not have good answers for them. She had simply done what needed to be done because someone had to do it, and she was the only person available at the time. When the reporters asked her what it felt like to single-handedly hold off an entire Ravager war fleet, she told them that she had not been alone. She had her crew counting on her and 50,000 colonists who needed those extra hours to escape. Sometimes people just had to do their jobs, no matter how hard or dangerous those jobs became. That was what military service meant, and it was what she had signed up for when she joined the academy. The interview was broadcast across human space and picked up by alien intelligence networks that distributed it to governments and military organizations throughout the galaxy. The words of the small human female were analyzed and studied and discussed in war councils and strategic planning sessions. What disturbed the alien analysts was not what she said, but how she said it. There was no boasting or pride or sense of accomplishment in her voice. She spoke about holding off 50 enemy warships the same way someone might describe fixing a broken machine or completing a routine maintenance task. Over the following months, predator species across the galaxy began implementing new operational protocols designed to avoid encounters with human vessels carrying cadet-level crew members. The Ravager clans issued standing orders that any ship showing human cadet identification code should be considered a class of threat regardless of size or apparent combat capability. The insectoid swarms programmed their collective intelligence to root around star systems with heavy human training activity, even species that had never directly fought. Humans began changing their behavior based on reports about human cadets. Pirates and raiders who had operated successfully for centuries started avoiding shipping lanes where they might encounter human vessels with student crews. The stories had taken on a life of their own and grown beyond the simple facts, but the core message remained the same. Human young ones were unpredictable and dangerous and should be avoided whenever possible. Lisa Carter finished her recovery and reported for duty at the Advanced Officer Training Center on Mars. She still did not understand why everyone treated her differently now, or why alien governments seemed nervous about human military capabilities. To her, nothing had really changed except that she had more responsibilities and better equipment to work with. She was still just doing her job and trying to be the best officer she could be, but across the galaxy in the dark places where predators gathered to plan their next hunts, the name Lisa Carter had become something more than just a name. It was a warning and a reminder that even the smallest and youngest humans could be more dangerous than entire fleets of conventional enemies. They were just cadets, but the predators knew to flee.